So good evening, everybody. So I'm Fanindra from Vision 2020, the Writers at India. So I welcome you to this webinar on building upon the first COVID wave lessons and preparing for managing the uncertainty in the coming time. So this webinar is essentially a follow-on webinar that we had conducted a couple of weeks ago. We will run this session for an hour and a half. So I'm now requesting Aaron to take over and start the proceedings of the webinar, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fanindra, for the introduction. So to get things started, we have 5 topics that are lined up for today. And for the first topic, we would be having Dr. Venkatesh from the Arvind Eye Care System Group, who would be speaking about managing capacity and productivity. So the goal of these topics, as suggested, was to go ahead and identify how hospitals can actually manage uncertainty in this course of the second wave, and even prepare themselves in the likely event that there would a third wave that would be coming. We all know that the COVID-19 has actually raged across the country and has left a lot of glaring gaps and exposed the issues that are there in our prevalent healthcare system. And we do feel that, it is important for all of us to work together to try and see what we can learn from each other in these trying times. I request Dr. R. Venkatesh to kindly start the presentation for managing capacity and productivity. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Fanindra, for organizing this on behalf of Vision 2020. So that's a very important part of how do you take care of the capacity which you have built up, and also a high productive organization in a pandemic. So I'll be touching upon some of our learnings. So I'm sure most of you are attending will know about Arvind, which started 45 years back. Now we've got 7 tertiary care centers, 7 secondary care centers, community centers, and of course, a chain of primary eye care centers or vision centers in 91 places now. And on an average, we see close to 13 to almost 15,000 outpatients every day and do more than 1,500 surgeries. And through outreach, we bring a lot of patients, and a training center for a lot of residents, fellows, and also people who undergo short-term training and administration and things like that. So it's kind of highly productive organization. And last year, the end of March, April, when the outbreak happened, we all had to put safety as the first priority. We all had to do all these things which we have discussed about social distancing, hygiene, masking, and how do you make sure you change the behavior of not only the patients, but also your staff. We had to do a lot of things to work around it. Like what you see here, we had to even remove the central seating so that you put a tie or something like that. Finally, they keep a case sheet or a X-ray or their bags, and then that also has to be cleaned up. So we had to do a lot of things and processes around this so that we can function smoothly and also get the patients into the system who really need care during those periods. I'm just going to share with you interesting data which we just submitted for a WHO journal, which shows between 2019 and 2020 what's happening. Now, when you had total lockdown, the last week of April to May 3rd, the tertiary care centers were seeing 5% and secondary care 10%. And when the lockdown phase 2, when the road vehicle, your own vehicle was opened up from 4th May to 17th May, if you see the vision centers open, the vision centers were closed during this period because the staff couldn't come. Immediately, the volume jumped to 50%. And if you see phase 3, when own vehicles and taxis and autos started running, the OP went to 60% in vision centers, but the base hospital, it was just 18 and 30%. So that showed how this the primary care centers are accessible to people. And this we really learned during the pandemic. And following the unlock, if you see, the hospitals had 60 to 70%, whereas the secondary and tertiary were almost touching 90%. And then what happened in November, December, January, February, there was a significant increase in the volume. I think we saw this across the country. In the lockdown, 5% gradually increased to unlock. And during November, December, and post-Pongal here in south of India, we were doing 140% work. It was terrific to manage some of the daily load, both in the outpatient and surgery. And now in the second lockdown, we are back to 18% of our normal value. The point we have to keep in mind is this can go up and down like this. So we'll have to be prepared for another 140 or 150% once the second wave eases and before we get third wave. I think fortunately or unfortunately, I'm sure we have to pray that we don't get another wave. This is just to show you what happened in this couple of weeks when Tamil Nadu and Pondicherry went to lockdown. This is the 3 centers where vision centers are all actively running. If you see, the vision center volume is almost more than you're paying and significantly more than your free outpatient. This includes both new and review. If you see Tirunelveli, it's almost there. In Pondicherry also, it's slightly less because we are still not able to run all our centers because of lack of transport to some of our staff. This again shows that accessibility is so important in a condition like this where people are really easy to go or walk or go in a two-wheeler or in a cycle to a center. So one thing we started even when we had the lockdown is we were preparing for the big crowd. So our IT team did a lot of work to bring up the scheduling software, which really helped when we had that 100%, 120, 140% coming back into the system in November, December. So this is not basically appointment. It is basically you have to schedule for that day a particular time. So 9 to 10, we'll allow 15 patients for 1 unit. So 3 units, we'll have 45 patient slot. So that this helped us to reduce the overcrowding in the hospital and in the clinic. So this is one thing which we did immediately. The other thing which I want to stress is some of the high-risk patients, when they went to vision centers, they were not able to get an entry into Pondicherry. Like from Tamil Nadu to Pondicherry, you need an e-pass when the lockdown was happening. So what we did was we facilitated by giving them a letter which got printed in the vision center. So somebody who had a phacolytic glaucoma, a corneal ulcer, something which needs emergency care. So we will send them a letter like this. And now also we are doing it. If you see, this letter is dated for May 19, 2021. So even in this lockdown, this system is helping us to get the high-risk patients comfortably into the system. This is one thing, again, we learned during the lockdown, the previous lockdown, which we still follow now. Usually patients who are referred from vision centers for cataract surgery, they come the previous day, have the test done, next day surgery, third day follow-up. So what we did was we tried to do all the investigations in the vision center except biometry, even for a physician opinion they had taken. And then they come for surgery only on the day of surgery. They go back the same afternoon because they have hired a taxi, they have taken an auto rickshaw to come or in a bike. So they go back next day, they review there. So this learning is really helping us now. And this is kind of significantly reducing the carbon footprint also, which we are interested in. And day one follow-up, we were doing a few day one follow-ups in vision centers, but during the pandemic, we learned that why should they come back to the base hospital? Why can't they follow up there? Doctors are doing telemedicine to all the vision centers. What can we miss? So we can't miss anything unless there is significant problem. So any complications, we made them wait in the hospital. So if they were like a non-complicated surgery, then we asked them to go to the vision center the next day. Almost 60% of them were able to go to vision centers because around Pondicherry, we had these 40 centers which were covering most of the geographical area. So this also again helped to reduce the crowd coming back to the hospital. And during the peak crowd also, it helped a lot. So this is one example I'm just sharing with you because we have done a lot of incremental changes when the crowd came back into the system. So this is one idea which we did. Again, this idea came from a biometry nurse. She said, sir, the biometry is now, the volume is really high. Like normally they do 100, 120, it was going beyond 200 because daily we had to do more than 150 surgeries. She said, mature cataract, when they come, I put them on an IOL master, then I have to again repeat an immersion biometry. Why can't we separate for mature cataract? I said, it's a great idea, you try it. And then 2 or 3 days they tried, the feedback was so good that almost 40, 50 of them had mature cataract, which was segregated. And this simple change made a big difference in the life of patients and the staff. So there are so many things like that, which incrementally, I think many organizations would have changed. And from that learning, we should take on to how to tackle the second wave of patients, which is going to come. Teleconsultancy, it's happening through vision centers, but we tried, it wasn't very successful for somebody as from home connecting and things like that. But they always went to vision centers. So we thought, why don't we do some shared medical appointment for high-risk patients who couldn't come back for follow-up? So here you are seeing. Okay, see here you are seeing a glaucoma doctor interacting with 3 to 5 glaucoma patients. with the help of vision centers. So they go back there, they have their pressure checked, they have their medicines in hand, and then the vision center staff helps in interacting with the glaucoma specialist. So this is one thing which we tried, and it really helped us, and we have done several high-risk patients follow up through this. This is one thing which is interesting, which we piloted. I'm just sharing with you quickly. We wanted to call it as Uberization of eye care. Now, even in this pandemic, your Swiggy, everything comes home. So we thought, why don't we take a vaccinated, a PPE technician to the home of some of the patients? Like this patient was not able to follow up, again, a high-risk patient, and a glaucoma patient, a diabetic retinopathy patient. You can see him doing eye care. And then we have developed this portable virtual reality perimetry. So his perimetry is also done. And then he takes the brilliant fundus images with the Remedio fundus on phone. And then the images are shared with the base hospital, and the report is done by the doctor, and the opinion is given. So like this, we did a lot of things in patient care. But the point is, only a minimal number of people are involved in patient care in pandemic. So we didn't want this good crisis to go waste. So we had a lot of other activities for our doctors in the form of write-a-thons, where they had to take their thesis into publication. For the first time, Pondicherry crossed 100 publications in 2019. And of course, across the Aravind system, we did very well in publication. We did a lot of hackathons, like 3 or 4 hackathons with problems of COVID, and then how to solve it. And all this was shared across social media and publications across the India. And many of them, like the Eye Opener, Slit Lamp Shield, became very popular among ophthalmologists. We did video editing workshops for people to make award-winning movies. And we had a lot of activities for our MLOP also. So like this, we had to kind of use our human resource also very actively and usefully, so that we always take this dream along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that beautifully summarized presentation. And I think just by going across like some of the points that you've highlighted, I think there would be a lot of learnings for everybody present here. Now, we have some set of questions that were already asked by our members, which I would be addressing with to you, sir. So the first question is, what were some of the major hurdles for switching to an appointment-based system? And what would you advise for medium and smaller hospitals in switching to an appointment-based system?
So the main hurdle was, everybody knows that Aravind is a non-appointment system. So anybody walks in, they can come into the clinic and register from morning to evening. So when we said that you have to schedule, it was a rude shock for some people. So they had to go and wait in another lane where they had to schedule a time. So because we had to publicize this through social media, through our patient network, people who are coming back for review, we send them messages, but still, see, IT is still something which is, we say that go to your app, do all this, but it's not easy for somebody like a layman who comes into a system like Aravind. So we have to facilitate them. So that was a challenge to begin with. So what we did was, we said we'll try in a challenging population. We tried first to the pre-hospital patients, even in Pondicherry and other hospitals. So we were able to schedule, but the only thing is there was another line waiting outside, so that they get a time slot, and then they have to wait for the time slot to enter into the hospital, which was not the normal case. So it is basically not appointment, but like a time schedule wherein you will enter. So you would come at 7:30, but you will get a schedule only at 9:30. But this really helped us to manage the crowd inside the hospital. So we were able to maintain a lot of social distancing and hygiene and all these practices. And also we were able to comfortably see that 140% jump which we had. And I'm sure many of the hospitals also had that. So again, if you are going to have a second wave of patients, after the second wave of COVID comes down, scheduling is going to really help us. So we are still building on it. We are seeing how to do it comfortably. Even in this low volume, we are continuing to do that scheduling.
All right, sir. Thank you so much. Sir, the next question would be, have you tried incorporating this scheduling system at the Vision Center level? And if yes, how did you go about the same, sir?
So not for Vision Center, but Vision Center is like, normally they see 20 to 25 patients. They're doing comfortably as they walk in at different time points. But people who come from Vision Center to base hospital, we are asking them to schedule. So they are now helping them to schedule the time, so that they get a printout right in the Vision Center that your time schedule is 9:15 to 9:30, you can enter. Like your passport thing, you get a small printout. So that printout is facilitated by the Vision Center staff now.
All right, sir. Sir, and there's one more question that had come from one of our members who questioned, do you feel that testing for COVID-19 should be mandatory for all IPD cases?
See, this question has been there from the first wave, or no, from since last March, April, and IJO or our AOS came up with a very good guidelines that for regular cataract surgery, where there's minimal time with the patients, we don't have to do a COVID testing, but this is kind of challenging even now. So even now, when we do a COVID test for somebody like a retinal surgery, orbital surgery, almost like 2 or 3% are positive. So they are already in the OPD, you're examining them, so you're doing all these things. So any major surgeries, we still recommend to have a COVID testing. Wherever there is longer duration of surgery, where there is blood involved and things like that, a lot of aerosols involved. But normally for a cataract surgery, we are not doing a COVID testing.
All right, sir. Thank you so much. And sir, the last question from the pre-panel questions are: if testing for COVID-19 is not available as a service within a hospital, how would you recommend an eye hospital go about requesting patients scheduled for surgery to get tested for COVID, as hospital-based infections would also be a concern? Like, a lot of patients would have a lot of hesitancy to go to a general hospital at this point in time to get tested. So how would you address that concern, sir?
See, that's a challenge which from day one, now people are saying they are totally COVID free, and you make them do a COVID test and they can get COVID during the testing. So that is what is happening. See, that is why government now also is coming with regulations to say how we can avoid unnecessary testing, for a flying or for regular elective surgeries, because all this is added burden to already the testing authorities for patients who are symptomatic. Now, who really need the testing, you don't have a kit now. So there will be a crisis of testing kits tomorrow, because that's where I think they're already saying, how are you going to look into all these aspects? Even for lab investigations, there is going to be crisis. So we have to keep all that in mind. But so in fact, we don't have a testing center. So we are sending them to the nearest medical college, where our paying patients have to pay a certain amount, and the free patients, depending on the government charges, they charge, and then they test them and give us a report in 24 hours.
All right, sir. So thank you so much for the pre-set of questions. I would be following up with Q&A that would be coming from all the attendees post all the 5 presentations once it's done. Thank you so much for your valuable learning and advice. And we definitely hope that the entire Arvind team is doing a fantastic job in these difficult, trying times. So with that, we come to an end to the first topic, which was managing capacity and productivity. We'd now go into a very critical function that would be discussed by, which is critical to every hospital for inventory, supplies, and consumables. How do hospitals go ahead and work and balance the act of maintaining their financial, their financial liquidity, at the same time make sure that they're not overstocked or understocked? And for that, I would request Mr. Anjanelu from LV Prasad Eye Network to kindly come and make the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Aaron, for a nice introduction. So what I would say is, what we have learned from this first wave pandemic, the healthcare organizations are not ready for the massive wave of demand and supply. Actually, we do not know about the pandemic beforehand, and then we do not know how we can deal with this kind of a emergency. And then we start here at LV Prasad. Supply chain is a support function. So we call all the people, with the stakeholders, particularly when we are dealing with patients. We have to take care of all the stakeholders into account, and then we called for a meeting and discussed how we go about it, how you want to run your hospital, how what precautions you have to take, and we have developed SOPs, standard operating procedures, and what to do and what not to do, and how we deal with both the emergency and all. So 35% of the hospital expenses are for the supplies, through supplies in the any hospital expenses. So supply chain is also a very important function. So it has to work in coordination with all other stakeholders, like particularly in patient care. What we have started in the beginning is we called all the stakeholders and then see how we want to run the hospital. So you want to run the hospital in full capacity and based on the numbers. So how initially in all our centers in the pre-pandemic situation, so we see 2,000 patients all over our network. Now we have 20 secondary care locations, 3 tertiary care locations, 1 center of excellence, and 200 primary care vision centers. So how we can we want to function, that is the main focus. And then we formed 3 groups, actually A, B, C, and initial stages for 2 days each. Team will work, and for all 6 days 3 teams will work. And if there is any problem with one team, the other team will take over and start working. So during the pandemic, I mean, there is national lockdown all over the nation. There is a lockdown, and then there is no, as Dr. Venkatesh told, there is only 18% to 20% footfall. So based on the footfall only, we have to work, and then how much inventory is required for our operations. So based on that, we have to plan, and what would be our consumption, and then who are the people. No, particularly, no, for regularly our operations, we do not have any problem with supplies. The more important thing is the COVID supplies. COVID supplies are very new to any of the organization, so we do not know where to get and what kind of PPE kits and what kind of N95 mask we need to use in the initial stages. Later on, lot of people came into the business, in general, and then more and more people came into the business, and then we see a lot of change in the behavior of the suppliers, and then we get for a lesser price. Initially, we have got for inflated prices for 400%, 200% inflated prices of the PPE kits as well as the N95 masks. Slowly, once we develop our inside resources inside India, and more people start producing the N95 masks and PPE kits, and now we have a very good situation where we are stabilized, and then now we are getting for a reasonable cost. So that is very important. And what we have learned is how to reduce the cost and efficient operations. So first of all, operational efficiency and cost reduction is the two important steps. So what we have to do, so how we can reduce the cost, because we have a network of hospitals. What we thought is, no, because for regular supplies we have a decentralized procurement system, but for COVID materials we have a centralized procurement system where we can better bargain with the suppliers and then get a better price, because we actually maintain dashboards, weekly consumption statements, and get requirements from different hospitals and how much we require for entire day. And then based on that, we negotiate with the suppliers and get the supplies on a reasonable cost. So we see, on a daily basis, we ask everyone of our all hospitals to share with us the dashboards, like how many numbers you have opening balance, how many you got that day, and how many you consumed, and then what is the closing balance. This way we constantly monitor for some time till we stabilize, we got all the supplies in place without any hurdle. So that is what we have uh, done in the initial stages. And another thing is, like we have uh, done regular consumables, like, we have cataract consumables like gravitic acids, lauric acids, and infinitic acids, and IOLs also. We constantly monitor how the consumption patterns are, and based on the consumption patterns, we slowly increased the consumptions, and then we supplies also we increased. And after a few days, what happened, the slowly the footfall increased from 18% to 20%, then 35%, 40%. And during the October to December, we start seeing more number of patients, and based on our consumption levels, we started increasing our inventories. So another important thing is, no, evaluating the vendor performance is another most important aspect, where we regularly identify the reliable vendors and get commitment for faster supplies. So some people, they say that we will supply the goods, and then they ask for a advance payment, and after some time they say that we cannot supply because we don't have the supplies available with us. So we should be very careful whether these vendors are regular vendors, or they came for the purpose and then they will leave. So we have to be very careful, and we have to manage the vendors in such a way that no, they value the business, and then they will give a faster supply as well as this will happen only when you have a good relationship with the vendors, and then we have almost 10 to 15 years old vendors available in our vendors list. So this will be only possible when you make the payments on time, and then we have a good vendor relationship, so that this will help us in finding a way during the difficult times. That is one thing. And one more thing is maintaining stocks more than economic order quantity, particularly for the critical consumables like surgery consumables, as well as COVID-19 consumables. No, stocks, you have different types of stocks. You have stockable items, you have regular items, you have for stocks on consignment basis and all. So stockable items are those items which you can stock and based on your consumption patterns, and then you will see. So you have a reorder level, and based on the reorder levels, you keep the stocks in your operations. And usually the ideal stockable item would be 1 month consumption as a stock, and then some buffer, 15 to 20% buffer in case of lockdowns. When you have lockdown and all the things will be closed, and then it's very difficult for you to get the stocks. So when you know that there is going to be a lockdown, then immediately you get the supplies, and then keep in your stocks. So another thing is regular stocks, like no, you have housekeeping consumables, stationery items, and all these things. Usually that will happen in your town or city, where you can just order, and the next day or third day you will get within a few just in time in the earlier days. But now, because of uncertainty and lockdowns, and then very few time, no, a few hours of time is open for them to distribute the things. So what will happen is it will be better if you have 15 days stock of these regular consumables items. And then one more critical thing is no, most of the IOLs, and then uh, cataract consumables on consignment basis. Consignment basis is nothing but the vendor will keep the stocks in your place, and after consumption they will raise the bill, and then you need to pay. So you need not keep any stock with you, and then the vendor himself will keep all the consumed stock, uh, replace with the consumed stock. We'll keep the initial stocks with us, and then suppose if the 50 IOLs are no put in the initial stocks, so if we consume 30 stocks over a period of 15 days, and they will raise bill for the 15 consumed lenses, and then again they will replace those 15 lenses. So 50 lenses are intact at any point of time. So the same way for all cataract consumables, we maintain a stocks on consignment basis. So this will help, instead of keeping all the money to keep the entire stocks. You do not know which IOL is required for you for what patient. So what will happen? It is very difficult for you to keep all the adapter lenses in your stock, and then you have to unnecessarily make the payments. So that is that is the thing. And one more important thing is transportation. So particularly you have different locations, and you usually in the pre COVID conditions, we have a GST in place, where your supplies are from the local base hospital. Now what is happening is we have a central procurement system, but particularly for COVID materials, because unless and until you have a good quantity, they will not allow you they will not give you a good price, particularly for the COVID consumables. So what we have done is we have taken the requirement from all the centers, and then we negotiated with the supplier centrally from Hyderabad, and then we have moved all the supplies to all the locations as per their requirements. So there are two other important things is we have speed of data and reporting. Accurate data and inventory is very critical. Having right systems that provide accurate inventory is critical to avoid surprises. So we have a SAP system in place. We know what is stock available in different places. Like we have how much stock we have in different locations. So it is easy to move the stocks from one place to other when there is a shortage in particular place. And another important thing is build your own capabilities where possible. Like our innovation engineering team, they came up with a open source design of Wiser. Wiser means like we have a we use for the COVID consumable. So what we have done is we have procured for a very lesser price, and then we have distributed for all our staff in our network, and we have distributed the police and as well as the municipality staff also. So this is how we can manage inventory in all the in these difficult times. So now we don't know how long we have to continue like this, and how the pandemic will not wait for us, and then patients are in need, and we have to make immediate steps to maintain financial as well as operational stability. So with this, I will conclude my presentation. Now open for question and answers now.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. So we know that there's so much more that's to be said, and it's such a vast topic. But in the interest of time, we try to see whatever is possible, so that it can be of benefit to all our members. So two questions to you. So the first question is, so in case of lockdowns, so the question was, how should we go about stocking medicines, spectacles, and lenses at the Vision Center as well as Base Hospital? So what do you think is the right approach for this?
So usually the general concept is if you can stock 1 month of your drugs and medicines, particularly preferably you have to ask the vendor to supply the long expiry date medicines, because if you don't consume in a particular time, and it will get expired and it is loss of money. So what we can ask is the vendor, you can supply the long expiry drugs, particularly drugs and medicines. And then spectacles and lenses. Spectacles powers, you have spectacle frames as well as lenses. All the regular ready-made lenses you can keep in the Vision Center. In the Base Hospital, little more like cylinders and then other lenses, which you can immediately get and fix it. So suppose if your consumption is 100, and then you can put a 50 as buffer. So 150 you keep. It will be easy for us to run the operations smoothly without any problem.
All right, sir. Thank you so much. And so the next question is, what approach or parameters do we need to follow to keep specific number of IOLs of each power at the Base Hospital in times like these?
No, actually, if there is a stock on consignment basis, most of the hospitals, LVP run hospitals, we have most of the vendors are agreed to keep the stocks on consignment for IOLs, because we do not know which power get consumed, and we do not know what patient requires which power. So ideally, it will be regular powers from 18 diopter till 26 with 0.5 diopter range in all the centers, 3 each. If we don't have a consignment stock in place. So that would be an ideal situation. And if there is any customized lens or in any low diopter lenses, you can always ask the supplier to supply on demand. So
Right.
you can ask the patients also, you can inform that this particular diopter lens is not available. You have to wait for some days till you get this particular lens. You have to wait and then get the surgery done.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll be following up with more Q&A once all the sessions are completed. Thank you so much for your valuable input and learning for managing inventory in these difficult times. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
With that, we come to a close to the second topic. Now we would be going to the next topic, which is one of the most critical functions in any eye hospital, and it constitutes the largest expense on the balance sheet of every organization, which is the human resource component. So in these difficult times, we would look forward to speaking to Dr. Madhu, who's truly a pioneer in this field, and had made a complete turnaround, as mentioned by Dr. Phanindra earlier, for Sitapur Eye Hospital. We are privileged to have her learning here, and she would be discussing about retaining of HR and HR management practices in the time of COVID. With a lot of people having so many questions on how to go about it, we will get maybe some tips of wisdom which we could go ahead and incorporate in our own institutions. So with not delaying further, I'd request Dr. Madhu to kindly take over. Thank you, ma'am.
So thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Vision 2020. It's really a pleasure being with you all. And it's impossible to define value of an invaluable source. The achievements of any organization are a result of combined efforts of each individual. So it's really like this thing. And hospital is in a unique place that HR doesn't consist of only employees. It also means trainees, patients. It's a big setup. And each category has got different kind of needs. And in difficult times, these needs require more exceptions because of the challenged times. And being an army person, I might refer once in a while to War and Peace because that's what it means to me. So first and foremost, it becomes easier to deal with the problem if you have a value-based team. And in most difficult times, what works best is the trust of team in you and your team in your trust in your team. Other than that, honesty, integrity, discipline, and spirituality. With that, what I mean is a compassion. If any organization has these values, times difficult or not difficult doesn't really make of a difference. And if you weave all these qualities with a good communication, it becomes a beautiful fabric. So what we really need is a highly motivated team and a fearless leader. And this is the most underutilized thing in most of the organizations. But believe me, it's not only increases productivity, but long-term loyalty. And what we say in army, people who face war together, stay together. So the best thing is to keep them stimulated and alive, because so many people in this world don't really die, but they die within themselves. Something of them dies. So this is where the crux lies in managing any organization or a hospital. So leadership has to be pretty good in the sense that they got to be role modeling everything and not only really preaching. And really important is to foresee what's coming ahead. If you can foresee, then you can plan everything in the mind, and you can start with the end in mind first. How will I make my timeline? And then make them understand with clarity and stand by in time of need. There isn't another way but to stand. If somebody has to die, the leader has to die first. So I'll give an example, simple example. When I joined Sitapur Eye Hospital, there was an OT list of 3 or 4 patients because it was a post-endophthalmitis epidemic. And finally, one sentence that worked for me was that if each one of the employee gets one patient also a month for surgery, we can pay salary every month. And I don't need to tell what Sitapur was. And then stand by I'm talking of the peacetime now. One guy got a blunt injury. District hospital was not able to really take kind of seriousness of the injury. I understood the gravity, shifted them, got him treated. And the most nasty employee became our promoter for making other employees in a better situation. However, every nasty employee doesn't turn out good. That doesn't matter. Even if out of 100, even if 10, 20 also you can convert into good employees, it's really good. Sometimes we lost some employees in the service and we looked after their families. And why I'm saying this is the prelude to, in difficult times, how people get motivated by you, right? So these are standard practices we use for team building. Then comes the transfer of your strategy that you have started with the end in mind. Then philosophy and transfer of power also in advance. The man who's sitting for a door-to-door screening will not come back to you every moment that this is what I need to decide. So unless and until there is a clarity of thought and people with high esteem, because they got the power to deal with, and minor modifications may be required. If there are any innovations, always promote them, because if anybody comes with an idea, say the person, oh, go ahead and do it, I am with you. And we'll see, it may not work, so what? Something will work. And then many times we require the younger ones who have a little dilemma of the decision making. Help them in the decision making and they're yours forever. Then comes in difficult times, there is no other way but protocol-based system. And these protocols cannot be the same protocols that were used earlier. The protocols had to be changed completely for the COVID. We didn't have all this at the gate and all this. So all the COVID related protocols, they had to be built in the system, practiced again and again. And also the people have to feel that this is being done for my safety. They must feel positive about it. So that is what the multiple ways we did these little things, but we did these things. Now coming to HR planning. As I said, 4C is the most important thing in the COVID, the peaks and there is lull. So when there is a peak, more people will fall sick, we will lose more people, but we will have lesser number of patients as well. We're not going to have so many. So our thing has been between wave 1 and wave 2, like 1 to whatever you call it, 1/3 to 1/4 patients come during the highest of the peak. And if you look at these peaks also, the peaks are in 3. Patients first drop, and then they become very little, and then again they start rising. They don't rise together. So 1/3 rule works. Keep 1/3 people for leave, for looking after family, for falling COVID positive, emergency leave, any kind of leave. Divide the rest 2/3 into 1/3, 1/3 into 2 halves. One working for a week, another one resting for a week. The rest doesn't mean really rest. That is the time used for the productivity. That means people are managing the OT, making the protocols, making the equipment maintenance, or the doctors and all, they are doing their thesis, they are doing their research papers, they are doing webinars, so many things. Then we come to retention, very, very important. Retention is something that is possible only when we have a team ready who is willing to change at drop of a hat. So change ready team is not difficult to manage at any time, but the communication for any change has to be directly from the policy makers or those who are who are heading the team. And with the arrival of COVID was good introduction and reassurance of COVID was what really helped us, that we gave them all the possible COVID knowledge and safety measures. And as I said again, trust in leadership is a single tool to manage any change. The head should be able to lead them. That's all. That's it. So we come down to what they really need in difficult times. This is the Maslow's hierarchy, which I'm sure you people must be knowing better than me. But in the most difficult times of life, whether it's a war, it's a COVID, the bottommost 3 become the most important needs. And if you can take care of them, then there is no way the employees will not be motivated to work, no matter where they are required to work. So how we went about it is that first thing is the fear of COVID itself. So assured, between first and second wave, vaccination for all, medication free of cost for everybody, extraordinary sick leave for the people who had COVID, look after leave for the families, space in hospital for isolation for the people who needed it, arrangement of oxygen, and transport to COVID facility if that was required. So with all these, people were pretty comfortable. Then personal safety. This is where it comes when it comes to that you can die. Then what becomes most important is me and my family. And for that, most important is that what will save me from my enemy, that is COVID. So what are my resources? So the resources were best possible PPEs, training at multiple levels, multiple times, because everybody needs a different kind of training. It's not about doffing, but actually what is the role, why they should wear it, and why they should commit to it. Then reinforcement, monitoring, and if it's not followed, punishment is, this is one place where punishment is absolutely justified. Then supply everything adequately. There should not be a want. Money is less important at this time. If you have more inventory of COVID items, there is really no challenge. I feel human life is worth 1,000 times more than any amount of money spent or money lost for that matter. But in this time, discipline is the key. You can't afford anything. The T has to be crossed and I has to be dotted. Like the first wave, putting the mask on people's faces, whether patients or employees, and making them follow was a challenge. Second wave, I didn't need to ask anybody to put a double mask. It was automatic. So this is where it goes, how the training in long term really helps. Then we took care of their daily needs. That is your groceries, fruit, vegetables, online shopping, and then the most important, talking all the time, connecting all the time, so that the fear can be taken care of, right? And this has to be done at multiple levels, and the correction and the feedback has to be real time. And most important is that nobody was allowed to feel in this organization that you are alone. We were all together no matter what happened. So then this is initially we didn't deduct any money. Then we had to deduct money for 2 months, and then we refunded all the money. And the code word was that there was, in the end, there was no deduction at all. good benefits, especially about the education, money, and all that were really important. People were kept quite challenged and excited by change they were dealing. That was really important. We ensured that everybody who was doing a good work was appreciated, and made them understand they are the value of organization and the leadership. Leadership is nothing minus them. So this is what it was, and they love to hero worship their organization. So compensation, statutory compliance, I'm sure we all are doing it, but recognition on daily basis, on weekly basis was very important. It really motivated people a lot more. We were not able to send really anybody for a holiday because it was not possible, but otherwise in routine life, we have place where we send people. And engagement of a spouse is a very important factor. If the spouse is not engaged, it's very difficult for the people to work in any organization. Then career development, we really worked on the development of career of medicals and paramedicals. So this year itself, 20 research papers were published, which was not actually a Sitapur culture. So this was really a very good achievement by the doctors and paramedics. Then trainees are vital sources. Their needs are different. So we shifted on completely to online education for lectures, demonstrations, and examinations so that nobody would lose an year. Surgical training suffered during lockdowns because the patients were not able to come. So we took them to wet lab. In between the patients came, there was live training. There was no loss of anything academic, and they were promoted a lot. We conducted webinars ourselves, attended the webinars, and this activity was a continuous process. The patients, they are the backbone HR, and sooner we identify, better off we are. So we connected with these people in any way that was possible, whether it was door-to-door screening that we had 6 teams going all the time, just after lockdown onwards, because we were not able to do camps. Vision centers were open most of the times. Then community level volunteers and ASHAs, they were connecting with people and collecting them together and sending to hospital for surgery. So that also really helped us. On the whole, 70,000 people were actually addressed in the field without doing actually even a single camp during this 1 year period. So that was, I felt, was a big achievement. And this thing is, we were not able to manage too many appointments because people are not used to it, but appointments and WhatsApp and phone calls, those were a routine matter. So on the whole, it worked in a way. So to conclude, lead from front fearlessly. HR is a leader and not a manager. Foresee the degree of challenge and prepare mentally. Mentally is more important. Those who sweat in peace don't bleed in war. So train more your HR so that they are comfortable. Forewarned is forearmed. So truly speaking, prepare everybody mentally, physically, and prepare materials and everything, whatever is required. Work on customized protocols because the old ones won't this thing. Discipline is the code word in a determined manner. Stay connected. Don't let anybody be off connect at any time. And then human beings are emotional beings. So they need to be mentored, guided through a value system, whether it's COVID crisis or otherwise, more in the crisis. Deal with the heart and not really with the head. And prepare for third wave. December, January is what I feel it will come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Madhu. I think that was a fantastic presentation, and everybody would have got a lot to learn from whatever you have shared. And it is in truly a time where we need to be empathetic, not only for patient care, but even for all the staff who are the backbone of our entire service delivery system. So coming to the questions, ma'am, I will be asking you a couple of questions. So the first question is, did you have to curtail on salaries through the course of the lockdown for your staff? And if yes, how did you communicate the same to the staff?
We deducted a small amount for 2 months. And the method of communication was that I put them all together. That means doctors in one sitting, HODs in one sitting, and I spoke to them. We are short of money right now. So we cannot give full salary, but it will be incremental depending upon the little reduction for the lesser salary. And I myself offered 50% reduction straight away. So that was the role modeling thing. And second thing was, I assured them that by end of the year, we will pay 100% to you, because in my mind, I was sure of my people. I trusted them. I knew they will be able to earn. So once they knew that this money is only a thing, because if I took loan from bank to pay them, I would have needed to pay interest, and that would have kind of affected the increment in this year. And we were able to give increments also.
All right, ma'am. So just following up on that question. So how did you go about the entire appraisal system, knowing that financially the system, like the situation was actually still pretty uncertain?
See, appraisal, I had spoken earlier only as I prepare mentally people at least a few months in advance. So I told everybody that we will not be able to give you a big appraisal, but we will give you an appraisal. And if we have more money left in the year end, the money would go to you all. It's your money, it will go to you.
Great, ma'am. The other question is, as an institution, you've already highlighted some, but could you tell of any measures that you've taken for any COVID-19 affected staff or their family members in terms of how did you go about handling the entire situation?
See, we have a safety officer. So first and foremost, anybody has complained, the first person to be reported to is safety officer who gets the test done for them. If anybody comes positive or comes negative, if a person is positive or otherwise second wave on symptoms alone, we would issue a medical kit, and isolation at home is possible, not possible, a ward in the hospital where the person will stay. And those people then would not be able to go out. So their groceries, everything is delivered at home. If nobody to cook, then the cooked food is delivered. One person required oxygen from the vision center side. So we got this person to Sitapur, got the CT and everything done. He still chose to go back. Again, we had to get him back. So we had people here. Then we have oxygen cylinders and oxygen concentrators. But touch wood, other than him, nobody really required it. 2 doctors were sick, but one was on leave, so he was in his hometown, and other one chose to sort of go to a medical college in Allahabad because he had somebody over there who would be taking care of him. These 2 were doctors, so they chose to be in bigger centers because Sitapur doesn't really have anything much in the district.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And the last question is, while it's very difficult and generally rostering is part and parcel of the HR department, and you've shared some of the key measures, it would be great if you could just highlight on how you went about scheduling rosters for the staff at the hospital, as well as vision centers in the pandemic time.
See, vision centers, we have 12 functional vision centers because 2 have been taken over by the government. So in vision centers, if anybody felt COVID positive, we had to see the gravity at that time if there are so many cases or not so many cases. If there weren't so many cases in any center, there were centers like that which were falling in containment zone and all that. We did not replace a person there. Otherwise, we replaced the person. So that was for vision centers. For the hospital, as I said, the wave itself, wave is about 3 to 4 months. So you divide this into 3 months. 1 month is a hell. In that hell, we get only about, say, 1/4 to 1/3 patients. So that 1/3 rule I have maintained, even people don't fall sick, send them on leave, let them take leave and feel more comfortable. And then rest of the team is in 2 parts, because if this something becomes positive, somebody becomes positive, or many people become positive in one team, the other person immediately comes over and takes over. And then normally as a standard, unless and until a person is symptomatically comfortable, even if the person is COVID negative, would not come back to duty no matter what, because we have that sufficient, what should I say? We have sufficient cushion, and people were willing to work more. Suppose somebody falls sick, there were people who were willing to do extra duty. So there was no challenge really.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think it's been a great learning for everybody here. I'll be following up with questions post this session. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thanks a lot.
With that, we come to an end to the retaining HR segment, and now we go into the next component, which I felt is one of the most neglected components for many of the institutions that are working in eye care. And for that, we had to look at, we went ahead and found a resource person outside the eye care scenario, who is an expert in what we call corpus building. With so many things being affected through the course of the pandemic, with low patient flows, low surgeries, it is absolutely important for an organization to be financially sustainable. And to create that solid foundation, we thought it would be right to get an expert's opinion on how an organization or an institution can go about to building a corpus of their own, so that in times of crisis like these, we don't have to take harsh steps of maybe laying off staff or basically, curtail on our service delivery mechanisms. So for that, we're really fortunate to have Mrs. Vanessa D'Souza, who's the CEO of Sneha. And ma'am, I'd request you to kindly share your presentation and take it forward from here.
Thanks. Thank you, Aaron. And hello to everyone over here. I've actually really enjoyed the sessions because I'm from a completely different background. I work with an organization called Sneha, and Sneha works to improve the health and nutrition of women and children in urban slums of Mumbai and also reduce gender-based violence. When you look at funding, and I think this last pandemic, I think one thing that all NGOs have struggled with is, how do we resource ourselves to be able to just continue our work? And none of us can leave our beneficiaries. We're in the middle of work. And like I heard you all saying, there are so many patients, there are, different eye issues, you can't just stop your work. So how do we build this corpus of funding and which will actually help us to tide over difficult times? I want to actually share with you an example of one of the best known universities, which is Harvard University. Harvard University has built a corpus of $40 billion, and their operating profit, annual operating expense is $5.4 billion. So they actually use the corpus to fund their annual operating expense. Now, Harvard has taken 4 centuries and 14,000 people to build this corpus, right? All of us don't have that luxury of time. We don't have the name that Harvard has. But we can take some steps to start, if we've not already been doing it, to begin building this corpus. Before I go into the how of building the corpus, I wanted to just bring out a very critical distinction between what we call the corpus versus general donations or reserves or general reserves. For most of us, when we think of an organization, we think of corpus as being this fund that is available to us to use at any time for our operational expenses, especially at a time like a pandemic. But a corpus in the legal sense of a term is actually a permanent fund. It is a fund that requires permission of either the board and in some places the charity commissioner to be able to use those funds. The corpus itself is capital. So like a company has capital, an NGO can also have capital, but the interest on that corpus can be freely used by the NGO. So it is important for every NGO to build some capital or corpus to be able to tide them over through emergence at difficult times. But some NGOs which are governed by the charity commissioner in some cities, like say Mumbai, Delhi, etc., they actually have to take prior permission to use funds of the corpus. Now, this can be very painful because we all know how difficult it is to get funding from the government. So what we do at Sneha, while we build a corpus, we simultaneously build what we call general reserves and program reserves. These general reserves typically can be used, you can either allocate it for a particular program. So I don't understand your business very well, but let's assume you have some amount of money that is put for surgery, some amount that is put for training, something for research. You can actually start allocating funds to each of these. You don't necessarily need to use them in that year, but you can start building a reserve for each of these different functions in your organization. Now, the general reserves don't need any prior permission. You can use the funding at any time. So most organizations would always try and build a judicious mix of corpus as well as general reserves. So let's come to fundraising. Fundraising is always seems like this enigma. How do you raise funds when you're a hospital, you're a medical professional, you're a nurse, and you're trying actually to provide services to people who need the services? I think the first thing that fundraising you have to recognize is that fundraising is a very core function. And most of us at the NGOs, focus on our programs and on the beneficiaries and the work and the impact we want to deliver, without giving as much focus to fundraising. But fundraising, of course, as we all know, is the blood of an organization. Right? So the first is to have a dedicated team of fundraisers. It doesn't have to be a big team. It can be a smaller team, and we can discuss that later. The second is to have a very clear fundraising plan. You need to know how much money you want to raise, from where you want to raise it, and how you want to raise the funds. And it is a continuous process. It goes on through the year, every year. Like all our other work, it's very important to measure the impact of fundraising at every single stage, because when we start measuring, we learn what is effective and what is not effective in fundraising. As most NGOs, we try a million things, but everything doesn't give results. So I wanted to share with you, we actually used to do a lot of, try and do a lot of crowdfunding. So we would use Instagram, we would use Facebook and try and run campaigns, but we were never successful in running online fundraising campaigns until a certain event, and I will come later to how things changed overnight for us. And last and very importantly is using technology to fundraise. Now, I know in the medical professional, I'm sure you have a lot of priorities to invest in equipment, but somewhere I think it's important to see how you can invest in technology. The way I see it, it isn't an expense, it's more an investment that more than pays for its expense. I want to share with you how Sneha started using technology. Earlier we were using spreadsheets, Excel sheets. We had multiple sheets of prospects. We would lose the sheets. Somebody would resign. We would lose names of prospects until we decided to get a customer relationship management system called Zoho. So one of the things that Zoho does very effectively is Zoho helps us to track our prospects. So we have this prospect database, and Zoho, and you can see this funnel over here. So if you look at the top of the funnel, you typically see at the top of the funnel, you identify a certain prospect, right? Then you'll have a site visit. Then once you have the site visit, you meet you begin to understand what exactly that donor is looking for. Donors have different needs and different expectations, and it's very important to understand that to match their expectations. And then you move down the pipeline, you send your proposal, you negotiate with the donor, you have an MOU, etc. But what we do in all this is at every stage, you have an amount of that you expect the prospect to get. And sometimes you have to estimate that amount. You don't always know the amount. And the second is there is a probability attached to every stage of the funnel. So at any given point in time, quantitatively how much of money is in your pipeline and what is the probability of that money coming in. And this is very valuable because the more you have with higher probability, the more chance you are of being able to fund your work on the ground. I'm sorry. The second, another dashboard I want to share with you is these are all different programs. So CHN is Child Health and Nutrition. The next is the Empowerment of Adolescents. That is a Healthy Cities program. For every one of these programs, we have an annual target, and then we are constantly measuring ourselves against the target. Right? So if you have gone over the target, then you have funding not just for this year, but you have a small reserve for the next year. And especially for a senior manager, it is very easy for you to very quickly know where your funding gaps are and where you need to pay attention. This is an example of a campaign. We run a lot of fundraising campaigns, and this is one example of an annual fundraiser that we have. And these are individuals and corporates that subscribe and donate for the annual fundraiser. So we are able to track every single campaign of ours online, and we know exactly which prospects the campaign material has gone to, how much they're willing to give us, and what it will take to reach the target amount. Using this data, we found has made a huge difference to our efficiency. We are able to be much more focused on the larger names. We're able to allocate larger names to board members, to senior members of the team, and keep the smaller donors to the rest of the fundraising team. But before we go to fundraising, I think one of the most important things is brand building and communication. When I joined Sneha in 2013, but 2 years before that, I volunteered as a fundraiser. So the founder of Sneha, who was a medical doctor, she came to me and she said, we're a bunch of doctors and we don't know how to fundraise. So can you come and help us? And what surprised me is when I went out to meet prospective donors, nobody knew the name of Sneha. Sneha. So then I asked the founder one day, I said, people know Akanksha, they know Pratham, they know Magic Bus, but why doesn't anyone know Sneha? And the founder very sweetly said, we try and keep a low profile. Now that's a very noble task, but when you need to raise money, you really need to be out there. You need to talk about what you're doing. You need to create a brand identity. When people see your name, there must be a promise of certain quality that the prospective donor gets to mind. And this really helps to simplify the whole decision-making process. I want to share with you how we have actually done, this is one of the brand building exercises we did. We had during the pandemic, in the early days of the pandemic, we had a professional marketing organization that just sent our communications person an email saying, I'd like to run a campaign for Sneha. I know you work on gender-based violence, and we'll provide our services free of charge. And this was actually the first time when we were extremely successful in crowdfunding. We ran this campaign called Lockdown May Lock Up. And as most of you had heard, during the lockdown, domestic violence had increased quite significantly in the slum communities that we work in. People were locked in, there was high anxiety, there was little or no income. And we ran this campaign, and this marketing company was able to bring celebrity endorsements for us, all done pro bono. We had a target of 5 lakhs when we started this campaign. We ended up raising 15 lakhs in 2 weeks. But more importantly, if you see our social media followers in 2 weeks increased from 700 plus to 9,000 plus. Now that's important because 1 year later, we still have some of those followers who come back to us wanting to support us in various ways. So focusing on building your brand, if you can get professional organizations to work pro bono, and there are many organizations that are happy to support, NGOs, please try and do that, because this is one way that you can really increase your fundraising. The other point I wanted to share with you is leverage the network of your donors. Of your corporate in donors and volunteers. One of the things that we have done is we have done so many campaigns. No amount is too little. No campaign is too much effort. So the one on the extreme left that you see, this is a school student who wanted to just run a campaign for Sneha. We've had one of the most successful ones has been what we call the campaign gratitude, a very interesting model where we had an investment, a private equity company that reached out to all their employees and asked their employees to run small campaigns within their own networks to raise funds for Sneha. They contacted their vendors, they contacted their clients, and they asked as many people as possible to run little mini campaigns for us to show gratitude during the time of the pandemic. And we were able to raise 83 lakhs in 1 month's time. And this all started with just one conversation with this one private equity firm. So similarly, we're looking at artists. You see, Saving the Artist, we'll do tie-ups with artists, with photographers. It doesn't always raise a lot of money, but I think the awareness of your name and the work you do pays in the long run to bring in the funding. So where do we start? I think that's a very good question for anyone who's not really focused on fundraising. And I would say start with the core. The core is your founder, your board members, your senior management team, or any significant donor who really understands your work. They feel aligned to the mission of your organization. They can be the best spokesperson for you. So start with them, and then you move out to the next layer, which are employees. In your case, your medical doctors, nurses, technicians, everything counts. Even a sharing on social media of all of theirs will help you. Running a little campaign, which they can possibly do in their own network, that will also help. We've had many of our staff running very small campaigns, but everything counts. And then finally, you go to your peripheral supporters. These are typically retail donors who will come on your website. Maybe they'll give you 500, 1,000 rupees. Some of your social media followers who may not give you anything. They might like your page, they might share your page, but you would definitely want to get a hold of these people and move them from that outer circle into this core of the circle, so that they really understand what you're doing and feel very, very aligned to your work. So how do you do this? It's not so simple to do. And here I want to share a specific case story to share with you that moving somebody from an outer circle to an inner circle takes time, it takes effort, but returns. So you obviously need to be very selective about which of these people you move in, and that's where data really counts. You can profile people as soon as they give you, that you can just allocate a probability to somebody who, if you run a large campaign and have just 1,000 rupees being given by, say 100 people, but if somebody is able to profile these people through, say, a LinkedIn profile, you can quickly know who is potentially not worth 1,000 the 1,000 rupee donation, but probably give 1 lakh. So that's an example of a donor who was US donor who we first met in 2014. It was actually at a dinner hosted by a board member of ours, and that's where he got to hear about Sneha. And then gradually we did site visits. We could send him regular updates on our work. But the big shift really happened in 2017 and 2018. In 2017, this US-based donor wanted to set up a technology platform for NGOs. And he came and he wanted to understand what Sneha does in technology. And we use a lot of technology for our program-related work. And at that time, we opened the doors to him. We shared with him how we do data collection, analysis. We use a business intelligence system for our programs. And that's when he actually began to understand the work and value it. And in 2018, he came with his entire family to do a 3-week volunteering assignment. And at that time, he ran a campaign, before he came down. And you see a donor from 2014 to 18, from being a prospect, he moved to raised $148,000. And then subsequently, just to support a strategy initiative, this is not core work, he gave us an additional $10,000. So I think the important thing is to keep investing, choosing the right prospects, and keep investing time in these prospects. Everyone is a fundraiser. And I think one of the important things here is, it doesn't matter who you are in the organization. It doesn't matter what level you are. If every one of the employees can consider themselves important in the wheel of fundraising, I think that's critical. So I want to share with you how we bring in our field staff. So our field staff are typically people who live in the slum community. So they certainly cannot contribute in terms of funding to us. But when we do a donor review meeting, it may be at a donor's office or it may be a visit, into our office. We always make sure that a team always addresses the donor. We make sure that everyone at every level, even if they have to contribute for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes in that review meeting, they contribute for 2 reasons. One is the donor really gets a sense of what these different level of people are doing in your organization. 2, the passion with which a field worker can speak. I don't think many senior management people can speak like that. And 3rd is, I think that the field staff begins to value the donor. They don't consider themselves just operational people. They have an important role, that vision that you want to achieve, for which you are trying to raise funds. Leveraging the power of the board is another very important thing. Like I shared with you earlier, we very proactively reach out to our board members. They host dinners. We reach out to their networks. Every time we have a prospect list, we bounce it off our board, the board members, find out if any of them can speak to these, to a senior person in that organization, so that we're constantly leveraging off the network of the board members. The 3rd is bring in pro bono services. Everything doesn't need to be paid for. Like I shared with you, how we brought in the marketing organization. In 2014, a year after I joined, the board was extremely concerned because Sneha was running 28 daycare centers addressing malnutrition in children under the age of 3 years. And they were extremely concerned about the risks to these children. And we wanted to bring in one of the big 4 accounting firms to do a risk audit for us. And obviously we couldn't afford it. So we actually then worked with them to see how they could do this for us pro bono. And I think, we often don't ask enough, but I think the most important thing in fundraising is to ask. And most people, all of you are doing just amazing work. And I think it'd be very difficult for most people to say no to you if you ask for a pro bono service. And the last is volunteers. I think, we sometimes underestimate the power of the volunteers. People who, a lot of our fundraising is done by volunteers. They don't charge us anything. They reach out to their networks. They bring in very unique skills. So for example, an annual fundraiser, and I've actually put a graph there to show you, how we run a fundraiser every year. This fundraiser, the funds are by and large raised by a team of volunteers. Our own field staff do more of the operational stuff, but the network is mostly the volunteers. The reason I wanted to share this campaign with you is actually the biggest message that I have is fundraising is a process. It is a process that needs to be done consistently every day by everybody year in and year out. And unless you build in that discipline of constantly looking at fundraising as a very core function in your organization, it's really hard to build a continuous source of funding, which will help you, especially at a time like this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa ma'am, for all of those unique insights that is coming from a different sector altogether, but definitely very, very relevant for all of the institutions that are majorly NGOs within the eye care sphere. And even for those which aren't, I do think that there were a lot of valuable lessons that are there. So taking too quickly to some of the questions that we'd like to ask you, which we had already collected. So the first question, ma'am, is, on an average, what percentage of surplus should an institution apportion to their corpus development each financial year?
So, we try and do about between 5 to 10% each year. It's not, we don't always manage it, but we try. Our aim is to do 5 to 10%. But there's just one important point I want to raise here, is when we present budgets to donors, we always ask for a 10% administrative cost. And that 10% is quite important to manage your central functions like finance, HR, fundraising, communication. And so anything you raise over and above through campaigns and different activities and events, through crowdfunding, you can actually put that away towards your corpus. And that's what helps you to constantly keep filling your reserves and corpus.
Ma'am, following that up, I think the one question that comes to mind now is, how should an NGO go about building and developing the entire fundraising team?
Aaron, when I joined Sneha, we did not have anybody in the fundraising team. I mean, the founder used to use her network to reach out. And I have to thank the board. The board was actually quite keen that we build a team. So we started off with only one person. And this was in 2013. Today in 2021, we're 3 people. So we have a very small team. We have a very different skills in the team. So we have one person who heads the team, who is actually used to work. She's a management consultant. She's an IIM Bangalore person, extremely qualified and competent. And I think your senior person needs to be very competent, because that's the person who's going to be meeting the donors, who's going to be checking budgets, proposals, etc. The second person we have, it focuses on running all these campaigns that I shared with you, whether it's art campaigns, crowdfunding, finding partnerships, so constantly looking for new and innovative ways to raise a corpus. And the third person, it just manages our back end. So managing the customer relationship management system, making sure donor receipts go out on time, all the back end work, MOUs, etc. So, it's a very lean team. Generally, so we're at right now, 2021-22, we're at an annual budget of 32 crores. For our size of NGO, typically we've seen in most organizations, they have between 3 to 5 people that fundraise. I think anything more than that, you'll have a problem, because donors will ask you what the cost of your fundraising is. Our cost is 1 to 2%, of our annual budget. So it's very affordable. Most donors don't mind, paying for that kind of funding. And this is where, you bring in volunteers, you bring in pro bono services, and you can keep your costs pretty low.
Ma'am, one follow-up question to what you've just mentioned. So how does one develop that into a system that helps creating a pipeline of basically like funding resources over a period of time?
Yeah, so that's a very important thing, Aaron. A pipeline really is what I call the leading indicator of your fundraising. If you have a strong pipeline, then that money will keep coming. So what we do is very proactively, we build out our pipeline. You have directories that can give you CSR donors, for the kind of focus area working on. Somebody is reviewing this every year, the new directories that come out from FICCI, ASSOCHAM, all the industry associations, and updates it. The second, we focus on Indian foundations. So again, we use organizations like Samhita, Funds for NGOs, there is another one, which, I would urge all of you to, it's called india.candid.org. I would urge all of you to use this, because this is a really interesting database created by somebody in the US, where you can narrow down exactly what kind of focus area, whether you want an Indian donor, international donor, what the size of the donor, etc. And you can actually get names from there. So we have somebody who's constantly updating this prospect database, and not just updating it, then it has to move down the funnel, right? So you've seen how the funnel is, and we're constantly monitoring that names move from that prospect right down the funnel. So there has to be a movement that is happening. And this is again where the CRM system happens. When it comes to individuals, like I said, most people give to a person. They don't give so much to the organization, especially if you want a large amount. A small amount, they may give through a crowdfunding. But the minute you're talking of somebody giving 1 lakh, 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, 50 lakhs, they're actually giving to the person. They're actually giving to somebody whom they trust. And so therefore you need to cultivate these relationships. Like I said, it takes a long time. It's not easy. But I personally have a list of HNIs whom I am regularly in touch with. And in the pandemic, Aaron, we had actually a funder who overnight withdrew funding from an entire program. And, all I had to do was make calls to some of these big HNIs, and we covered 3 months of funding till we were able to then get an alternate funder in, just with relationship. And therefore, having this group of HNIs whom you can pick up a call, they'll cut a check for 20 lakhs, 25 lakhs, 30 lakhs, is so important during a time like this. So, you need to build this. It doesn't happen overnight. It needs regular meetings. It needs updates to them. It needs very personal, board members might need to meet them. But I think it's worth investing in a group of people like this who are your go-to people for a crisis.
And ma'am, the last question, what is the typical turnaround cycle time from identification of a prospective donor to going ahead and closing, a funding deal through your years of experience?
So, typically in terms of time, I would say it would take anything between 3 to 6 months, right from the time you first meet the donor, then the site visit, then, proposals, et cetera, the MOU, et cetera. If you look at the numbers, so if you reach 100 prospective donors, you'll probably be lucky if you close maybe 3 or 4. Okay, I'm talking about large, right? So I'm talking about 1 crore, 2 crore, 3 crore type donors, right? If you're looking at, therefore your pipeline is so important. From those 100, many will fall off along the way. And by the time you reach to the high probability, you're probably down to just 4 or 5, maybe 6 people, and of which maybe you'll close 3 because, you brought them so far down the pipeline. And therefore, large donors, not only you need to have many prospects that you need to keep working because many will drop along the way. But you also need to keep that time frame. So if your financial year is starting in April, by October, your proposals, your budgets, your prospect list, everything has to be ready, and you have to be out there actively fundraising because this is like large numbers that you're talking of, right? And therefore, that discipline is really important. Typically, when we start a financial year at the start of the year, we've probably locked in about 65 to 60 to 70% of our annual budget by, in April of each year. And that's an important indicator that you need to track because, if you're behind that, then it's going to be very difficult to catch up that balance 30 to 40%.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We'll be taking the follow-up questions post this. And that brings me to the next topic. So, one key theme that is following from Dr. Madhu's presentation of discipline, even in times of crisis for HR, and similarly discipline even in terms of fundraising endeavors. So now, thank you so much, ma'am. Now I request Mr. Kannan, UV Kannan, who is there from Upper Assami Associates to come for the last session. I'll just give a quick introduction. So a lot of the hospitals are going to face challenges with regard to the, support service that of equipment within the hospital during the pandemic time, whether it be slit lamps, whether it be phaco machines, whether it be your microscopes or your investigation diagnostic machines. And I think this is a critical aspect which all hospitals will face challenges because service engineers might not be able to travel, due to lockdown restrictions, state guidelines, which can cause a lot of problems. So our goal was to reach out to an all-encompassing company, and none other than Mr. Kannan, who's representing Upper Assami Associates, which is known for the service delivery across these years, at least in our country. And we'd be very happy to learn from you in terms of what are the preventive and preemptive measures that we can take to ensure that patient care doesn't suffer. Over to you, sir.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Aaron. I'll be talking about why prepare for preventive maintenance, and we'll go by practice sizes, and we will also go by types of equipment and also acknowledge the people who helped me prepare this. Why do we really need equipment maintenance in ophthalmology? We are one of the advanced fields of medicine where there's a lot of diagnostic and therapeutic equipments that allows us to provide standardized care for all our patients. And having these equipments very fit ensures that we are able to minimize the turnaround time with the patient, and the staff have decreased exposure to any of these pandemic risks. And we get really good equipments, some imported, some high good quality standardized, but they still do fail. And but why do they fail? The reason being there is always a lot of mechanical movement with these equipments, and there is wear and tear. Electrical connectors have a wear and tear because of these movements, and sensors and actuators have a lifetime and they fail after some time. Optics accumulates dust, and there are a lot of other environmental factors like humidity, dust that affects the instruments. In the pandemic, there are many OPDs that have been structurally changed to have an increased airflow. This also exposes all the instruments to a lot of dust and organisms that were essentially not there. So there need to be extra precautions in maintaining these equipments to prevent failures that we already know of. So not every hospital would follow the same size. Depending upon the size of your practice, you'll have different protocols. What we see, we'll start with the smallest size practices, which are typically only OPD. There is probably an optometrist, registered nurse, and the doctor, and a couple of other assistants. They have no dedicated maintenance team. It's mostly OPD only practice. So what you do is, as a doctor, you advise your employees of how to operate the equipment. Most of the times, the breakdown happens because of improper use of the equipment. And this point about know your friendly neighborhood electrician, this happens to be very important for these small practices. The electricians or anybody who is good with wires or clean things, they come very instrumental in these times. All you need to have is probably a list of service numbers from your distributors of different equipments whom you can call quickly, get spares, or know what needs to be done to the equipment to keep it running. Moving on to a medium-sized practice, let's say 25 employees or less, multiple OPD base, and you have 1 or 2 OTs. Again, training is very critical. As you see, I got these 2 pictures of 2 medium-sized practices where they have a list of equipments, the list of distributors, and the contact numbers. One team goes further by adding really the person name who takes care of the installation and the service, and that's all then for a call. As in the previous talks, there's always a rotation of personnel. So the personnel who is in charge of maintenance might not turn up in any part of the work week or the work month. So this number list ensures that there is somebody who you can call and know about these instruments. And try to maintain some critical spares. We'll go over which instruments need what kind of spares. It also might require a simple solder station and some cleaning consumables for optics. Then we go to the larger ones. The larger ones are typically with more than 25 employees. They probably have a dedicated technical team taking care of many things, like even their AHUs and their water supply and everything. There are multiple diagnostic ways, multiple OTs. As we saw earlier, that might be very low volume of patient flow. So even in case of failure, you have lots of redundancy there. So with 20% or 30% of patients coming in, you really have a lot of redundancy. And even if one equipment fails, you probably have another one working in another bay or another OT. For larger organizations, they probably have an induction training for all the staff, where we should add do's and don'ts of equipment usage and train them every person possible. And also add refresher training for people early in their career so that they always know what to do. And maintain critical spares. We spoke with few hospitals, bigger ones like Shankranathalaya, Arvind, and we got what kind of critical spares they maintain for equipment. So now I'll talk about different equipments. What I have here is some data. One internally from Mapasami for what kind of spares we frequently ship, and another from Aravind Eye Hospital, Madurai, about what kind of services their biomedical team does. So for a slit lamp and IDO, we would consider as the most basic equipments that need to be there in place so that you don't miss a diagnosis. Advanced equipments could be open and used if needed. For the slit lamps, the most major failure is probably the bulb. It could be an halogen bulb or an LED, and it's electrical drivers. The other frequent service that you see is the filters don't work properly, the mirrors have accumulated dust, the bino has become loose, there's doubling of images. So these are some basic fixes that any biomedical team or an optometrist could be trained to fix. There's also, because of increased airflow, there's dusty optics, and equipments have been moved around to facilitate better ventilation for doctors when around patients. So things get loose. So there are some mechanical failures that happens. Slit lamps come off the rails and things like that. So I also listed the spares that need to be maintained. It's probably a bulb and a bulb holder, a fuse, power cord, switch, pot meter for varying intensity, the output cable, the power supply card. You might be running a longer card than you normally use inside your OPD base. And what we have been shipping through last few quarters of the pandemic are essentially these mechanical misaligned base wheels and connectors that have gone wrong. We surprisingly have a face frame assembly. This happens to be outlier from what we saw from Aravind data, because most of our customers use a refraction chair unit, and people happen to pull the slit lamp instrument tray using the face frame handles. And just like the electrical data that you see for slit lamps is mostly change in bulbs. And that reflects here in our data where the LED and the LED driver board needs to change. That's 30% of the spares that we ship. And we go on to the next equipment, IDO. IDO is very similar. We see that Aravind uses a lot of wired IDOs. So more than 40% of what service the biomedical engineers have been seeing is essentially loose connectors and soldering things back. And the spares that we ship are essentially the ones that affect the optics, the dust on the optics, the eyepiece covers to protect them, the power adapters to change. And the fuses maintained in the bigger hospitals, Shankranathalaya and Aravind, are probably a bulb and a fuse holder, and the connectors where they need to be. And for all other practices, this is a general best practice, whatever your size might be, always use the lens covers to protect, because there is increased ventilation, there is increased chance of dust. You could always use acetone and earbuds to clean it more frequently, or call your equipment maintenance person to do that. And do use stabilizers for all electronic equipment. Now this being summer, there is always a drop in the grid voltage that goes on. So stabilize. And if your equipment is using computers, definitely use an UPS and have a backup schedule so that all your data is being backed up and you have data for longitudinal study of all your patients or your research work. And because of decreased workload, you might not be opening up all the bays. So try rotating the bays that you use so that every equipment is being used. Turn off all electrical equipment on and off so that you always know what their working condition is and you're not surprised because you might not be able to use a bay because air conditioning didn't work. And clean all the equipment as per the training given by the installation technician or in the manuals, and use the dust covers after the use and cover them with dust covers before you do sanitization of the work area with any other chemicals. And never let any of these to be always in dark or damp places. Places. Even it might be an OT, or at least have a bulb running, or if you have a dehumidifier, that's even better in highly humid places. I'll move to the OT equipments. We'll start with the microscope. And in microscopes as well, the most failure is only in the bulbs. So most of the manufacturers ship a spare bulb and fuses and power cords. There's also probable issues with foot switch. That's the one that's being moved mostly. And if there are batteries in your wireless foot switch, see to that they're always charged. And the cooling fans are operating so that the chances of your bulb going burst are low. For phaco and vitrectomy machines, most of my observations are mainly based on the spares that we ship. The most spares that we ship are the handpieces. Since these are mobile and they're being passed between multiple hands and trays, this happens to be the spare that we ship out the most. Then the motherboards, essentially, because if people are not using stabilizers, that's the first thing that comes out. Always ensure that you have a 220-volt stable power supply. And if you're not opening your OT for several days, ensure that you start the vacuum unit, prime it, test the functions of irrigation, aspiration, and for variable phaco powers. And for vitrectomy, test the cutting and aspiration by dipping it in water. For doing diathermy, have the forceps on a wet gauze and see to that it gets cauterized, and try moving the IV poles up and down and lubricate them if necessary. Always clean up the handpiece after all these things, clean the tip, clean the tubing, and prepare as you would prepare for any other surgery. For all this data, I would like to thank Dr. Ramesh Thurayarajan from Sundarai Clinic, Mr. Vinod from Shankara Nethralaya, Chennai, Dr. Naveen from RKI Center, and Mr. Tulsi Raj and Professor Manikam from Aravind Eye Hospital, Mr. Ram and Dr. Mohan Rajan from Rajan Eye Care, and all the other knowledge that I got from the manufacturing head of the departments and the sales and service team. I'm open to having questions. And this shows the distribution of our sales and service personnel during the lockdown in the week of May 9th. So companies like us, we still help the doctors and hospitals keep their maintenance and their needs complete by having a pan-India presence. There are several other distributors with the same capabilities as well. So if you have any set of questions, please let me know. There's one question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for such a beautiful presentation. And I think this will be of huge value even in the CyberSite e-resource library. Just to let all the panelists know, this will be accessible still even post this, even at the Vision 2020 archive. So coming quickly to the question, since we are already beyond time, I would like to just have some of the questions asked. So the first question to you is, how should we approach negotiating our AMC and CMCs in times of pandemic if companies use the force majeure clause?
The first thing to remember in any contract is that negotiate before you sign the dotted lines and transfer your cash. That's when you have most of your leverage. See to that if you're able to include clauses where government is now having a forced lockdown either at a national level or at a local level. If you're able to exclude the CMC and AMC periods during that and bring that clause inside, these are very difficult times. If it is a no loss for either side, then it's going to be a very good relationship. If one side feels pulled down a lot, then probably the relationship might not work, because it needs to work in the toughest of the times. That's when you know your relationship is really good. So any negotiation should be done prior to you sign the dotted lines and transfer your cash. And people do understand when things go wrong during these difficult times. And I think most of the equipment manufacturers have given waivers on AMCs and CMCs. From what I heard, the big multinationals have given at least 4 or 5 to 6 months of AMC, CMC waivers. And I think many manufacturers in India, we don't really have a CMC or an AMC program, and there are always people ready to help. And even if it means attending to other things that might not be in our product portfolio.
So the next question is, how should a hospital strategize building its equipment maintaining capacity?
So we would first start with personnel. If you have a trained optometrist or a technician, ask him to be around when the installation goes on. See what are the preventive measures that needs to be taken. It might be even putting on a simple dust cover. And there are a lot of institutions like Arvind, Madurai, and LVPI Hyderabad that run training programs for maintenance of these equipments. If you're a large hospital, probably send one of your optometrists or electricians to go and maintain a solder station, have some cleaning supplies for your optics. That should be sufficient to start with. If you feel you're in a remote place and the spares don't reach you on time, then start setting up your library depending upon your frequency of maintenance failures. I think that would be a good way to strategically plan your maintenance.
Thank you so much, sir. Now going to the live Q&A. So I will start in reverse order. So sir, starting with Sir Kannan, there was one question that was asked with regard to the expensive spares. So like, our consumables, especially high-end spares for ophthalmic equipment, how do we go ahead and by what ratio, or is there any formula for us to go ahead and store some of these equipment at our own premises?
For smaller practices, I really wouldn't recommend. You might or might not use that spare. If your manufacturer maintains a library that has a very short lead time, then I would recommend using that. But since we talked about negotiating earlier, so probably negotiate for your spares and expansions at beginning of your contract so that you have a fixed rate during the entire tenure of your capital equipment being used.
All right, now quickly going to Ma'am Vanessa. There were a couple of questions that were asked, which she has answered in terms of type of questions used for platforms used for crowdfunding, and also what was the tentative proportion of funding that happens at various channels, corporate, individuals, and digital. Ma'am, if you could just give a small highlight regarding those two questions.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I responded. We typically, this proportion changes. We typically have, maybe about 3 years ago, we had about 60% of our funding from CSR. Now we're down to about 35% CSR, and we have very deliberately increased the number of international and local and Indian foundations and reduced CSR, because the foundations we found tend to give you longer term funding. And not only do they do funding, but some foundations like Ford Foundation, UNDP, Wellcome Trust, they also add a lot of value in terms of your research capacity, collaborations for publications, etc. The HNI component continues to remain very small at about 5% of the funding. What was your second question, Aaron?
Ma'am, the second question was, what are some of the platforms that you've used for funding?
Sure.
For
So we've
crowdfunding?
used, we've used Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. These have been the 3 platforms that we've used.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, moving to Dr. Colonel Bhadoria, ma'am, one question I'm going to ask you a couple of questions actually. One was, what were some of the measures that you had taken to motivate the staff to continue their work during the pandemic times, specific to your institute? And I would also request you to answer one technical question that has been asked by one of our, about our hospital requiring RAT for all OPD patients, as it has come as a directive from a COVID nodal officer from one of the regions in the Northeast. So request you, ma'am, to quickly just give your inputs on those 2 points. Ma'am, you're on mute. Could you kindly unmute?
So first and foremost is we got to identify what can cause demotivation, right? And in COVID times specifically, it was fear of COVID, means fear of dying from COVID, insecurity. Basically, these 2 were the factors. So how I dealt with them in the organization was, first and foremost is that the fear comes out of not knowing what the future is going to be. So arm them with knowledge about COVID through different kind of mediums, some, what should I say, some flyers, some verbal talk amongst different people as to what are the things that we can do at our level to prevent COVID. And in that came all the PPEs, masking, etc., etc. Then what they can do themselves to save from COVID. And in case COVID comes, suppose, then max they'll fall sick, we will take care of them. So that security, the moment that security came, that we can prevent it, it is within our control to prevent it. And even if you have, and then finally came the vaccination. Again, there was a huge challenge. I had to be the first role model to get the vaccination done to myself. Only then the team will follow. So therefore, when the vaccination came, they had to be told very clearly that it's not to prevent COVID, it is to prevent severe COVID disease. Despite vaccination, almost 70 odd people got positive, but they did not become severe, they did not become serious. So basic thing is alleviate the fear. And then there is a category called fear mongers and the deniers. So fear mongers are the people who generate fear amongst the entire crowd. So the first important thing is to address the fear mongers, address their fears. The moment they get confident, they stop fear mongering. And the people who are in denial that I am made up of steel and nothing is going to happen to me, those are the another set of people who need to be really addressed. That look, when you are also a human being like any one of us, and you need to have as much protection as anybody needs, because COVID doesn't know that. So this is what exactly was sort of done. And then you know what, somebody is behind you, what really helps. Believe me, that is the last word, is that there is someone, your organization will look after you, even if the ultimate happens to your family will not be on the road. So like, that's what helps people. And what was the second question? I forgot.
The second question was, there's a hospital that has been requested for mandatory conducting RAT for all of its OPD patients as well. So could you just share your opinion with regard to that? They're already doing
OPD RAT is not possible, because IOPD is large OPD, but for OT, even we have been doing RAT actually, and this thing is not really such a difficult thing. Now, of course, the self-test kit is available. So the people, we were getting it done because we had a COVID center right inside the hospital, right? But suppose even if that's not possible, RAT kits are available reasonably, all right, 200 something rupees a kit, and self-test is 250 rupees a kit. So now once it has been legally permitted, the hospital can keep a RAT kit and do it right there. It's as simple as that. And if it's possible to have it done, because whatever you say, Operation may be 10 minutes, but the patient is walking in a facility, staying with the other people who are going to be operated.
Correct.
And OR areas are slightly closer knit areas for the people to be there because they have more fears, they talk a lot more.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And last question for Mr. Anjanelu. There was a question asking, how do we control overstocking and understocking in such volatile fluctuations in demand? Like we just told, like, from zero demand to all of a sudden 140%. So from a supply chain perspective, Mr. Anjanelu, what should we be doing? How do we ensure that we are not understocked or overstocked in such volatile environments?
The basic thing is the consumption. How you are consuming the goods which you have already in stock, and based on the consumption levels, you have to plan things. Either you are overstocking or understocking. But understocking will not happen, but overstocking happens because you do not know. Some particularly these times like lockdown times, you do not know how many patients will come into your facility, and then sometimes you tend to overstock because thinking that more and more patients will come. But once the you have signals like when you plan day to day, if you actually look into the number of people coming into your facility, automatically you will know that there is a increasing trend of patients coming into the facility, so that you can increase the stock levels.
And thank you so much,
But
sir.
particularly for drugs and medicines, you should be very careful that you should not overstock, and if you stock, and the expiry dates should be a little longer, so that you can use at any point of time.
Sir, and the last question for you, is there any key performance indicator or KPI that is being used within the LV Prasad network as far as stock management is concerned?
Yeah, there are a few key indicators, particularly inventory turnover, and then average consumptions, how much inventory you are consuming on an average, and then holding cost, how much it costs if you put the inventory for a certain period of time, and then the stock outs. So how frequently your stock is getting out, and how frequently you are able to get the stocks in place. And then service level is also very important KPI, whether you're able to serve the people on time or not, and it is getting delayed because there is no supply. And another important thing is the lead time, how much time it is taking to replenish the things. Like once you order, once you consume the materials, how much time it will take to replenish. These are all the key process indicators, so for the inventory management.
I would like to thank all the panelists for the amazing, for first of all, for the valuable time and for the contribution that they've given. We've crossed by almost half an hour, but I'm sure that this has been an extremely valuable session for everybody, myself and Phanindra included. And we would like to say to all the panelists and to all the members that might have come, we've tried our level best to answer as many queries as we could within this little bit period of time. If there are any questions that are not answered, please write to the Vision 2020 Secretariat. We will get back to you. Due to paucity of time, we've tried to collate and combine a lot of the questions, and we hope that everybody had an engaging learning experience. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Phanindra.
Yeah, thank you. And so thank you, everybody, all the participants and all the resource persons, and Aaron for the excellent facilitation. So we formally conclude the session here, and we'll meet you sometime next very soon.